educational situation was still trying to deal with getting more kids into college, high school dropouts, and those kinds of issues. But today, I think we want to focus on the political and economic side of it. So I'm going to, I think Sharifa, you were mayor in this time period?
Yeah.
All right, so I think we'll start with you, and then have Rose to also talk about the relationships with the county and how she got to the County Board of Supervisors, and then we'll come to Carlos and Russell. Okay.
Thank you. One of the things that they sent us a list of questions, and they wanted, one of the questions was, when did you get to Nairobi and how did you get involved? Okay, so I was not part of that whole Nairobi movement. I didn't get here until '81. But the people who were involved in that movement had an influence on my actually running for council. And Bob, I don't know if I've ever shared this with you, but there were 3 meetings that I went to of the city council. So when I came here in '81, I immediately started teaching at Brentwood. So I'm from New York, you know, the city seals up at 7 o'clock and I'm from New York. So I started going to meetings because what else was there to do? And I went to one meeting where the city was working on its budget. And Bob at the time was the director of the city's recreation department. And in this meeting, the mayor cut the budget for the recreation department because he had a personal vendetta against Bob. I'm not gonna say who he was, but he had, and I was sitting there thinking, is that stupid or what? I mean, it doesn't affect his salary. All it does is deny more services to the kids, okay? So then I go home, then I come back, then I was on the Human Services Commission. So I go to another meeting. And at this meeting, the city had received some federal money to redo the football field at the old Ravenswood High School, but it was closed, right? So the staff had recommended redoing the irrigation system at Martin Luther King Park. So I went up as a commissioner and I said, well, you know what? I know that the sprinkler system might need to be done, but the reality is that if you go out there, there's tons of kids out there, and there's no place for them to play. So why don't we take that money and buy some playground equipment? And the same person who was a mayor at the time looked down and said to me, you can sit down and shut up, okay? Because kids don't vote in this community, and I wouldn't give a damn whether there was playground equipment because my kids don't go to that park. What? And I was like, right, that was exactly what my reaction was. What the? So then I go to the Children's Defense Fund, and Marian Wright Edelman posed this to us. She said, those of us who consider ourselves children advocates need to return to our community and put ourselves in a position where we can affect change for children. I came back and ran for city council. And I ran on a platform of, kids don't vote, give them yours. So I was the kid candidate, okay? I taught in the schools, so I reached out to all my parents. And so those are the ones that gave me their $5, their $10, their money to do the campaign. So when I got on the council, even though I didn't grow up here, I came with a strong commitment to the people of the community because they're the ones that put me there, okay? So for the first 2 years of sitting on the council, because I had sat on the council with that same person for 2 years, and there was all this infighting, there was all this, I don't like you, I'm not gonna give you this. I would be in the middle of a sentence, and he'd turn around to his majority and say, y'all ready to vote? And I was like, oh, guess I'm okay? It was terrible. Rose got elected 2 years later, changed the council majority, they selected me to be mayor. First thing I did was put playground equipment in every park, because the money was there.
Okay.
And that's the thing that bothered me, the money was sitting there, okay? So, as mayor, I felt that two things. Number one, my role was to figure out a way that we could work together to move the community forward. Because I didn't want to repeat what he did. It's like, what's, you can't criticize somebody for doing something, then you turn around and do it yourself. No. So I brought us together as a council, and we made some commitments to one another that despite any personal differences, that we would try to focus on the critical issues that the community was facing. And that we would give each other the respect, because everybody got elected by the community. So we had to respect the fact that they brought up constituents with them. And we had to figure out a way that we could all work together, again, to move the community forward. The first part of money that I went after were the CBDG funds, Community Development Block Grant Funds. Because some years earlier, Glenda and I ran a nonprofit. We went to get some money to do some work. We were running an after-school program. They denied us the money. Then when we went to the meeting, I raised my hand and I asked a question because they said that it was done on a reimbursement basis. We needed $35,000 to do the roof of a building. And I said, well, wait a minute. How does an agency, if I had $35,000, I wouldn't be coming to the county asking you for the money. But how does an agency access that money when we don't have it? And the person who was in charge smirked and said, well, usually they go to the city, but we know East Palo Alto don't have any money. And I was like, whoa, okay. So I started looking into, where does this money come from? How does the CBDG money get allocated? And when I found out that it was allocated based on unemployment, crime, okay, high school dropout, all the data, all the stats were from East Palo Alto. And yet, we weren't getting any of the money. So I arranged through Anna Eshu, and Anna Eshu has truly been a friend of this community. She had me meet with Henry Cisneros, who oversaw the CBDG funding, so that I could get an understanding of how does this work? How can I come back to my community and make this work? And what I found out was that there was a community committee that the county put together. So then, of course, my next question is, who's on the committee? Okay, well, of course, we didn't have a representative on the committee, but Fair Oaks had one. Half Moon Bay, they had one. So then I said, okay, well, how do they get a representative and we don't have one? They said, oh, well, between the two of them, they generate 20% of the pot. So I said, oh, well, Henry Cisneros had given me this report that had all this data in it, so I just flipped it over. I said, well, according to this information, East Palo Alto generates 10% of the pot, so I'm not quite understanding why we don't have a seat, okay? So through Ruben Morales, who was then on the supervisor, he had them create a seat. And then I appointed Albert Mitchell. A good selection. Because I was looking for somebody that, number one, was intelligent enough to be able to handle it, but would also be acknowledged for his credibility. He was an engineer at a USGS. It's like, oh yeah. Mr. Mitchell came and turned that whole thing around. So it was creating, so again, I felt like my role was to create access to resources that could be used to benefit this community. Same thing happened with drug funding, okay? David came and got me, Sharifa, I need you to come up here, talk to the county because they wouldn't give us the money. What? So I dressed up in a nice little suit. And David and I went up there to meet with the staff. And they explained to me that they had denied the funding.
David who?
Lewis.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, David Lewis, yeah. They had denied Free at Last the funding, they said, because they were too new. Huh? What? So Free at Last had a site, it was for a house. They had a site, they had the clients, they had everything in order, but they were considered too new. And the agency that they gave the money to, they had given the same money to them the year before. They hadn't spent it, but they were giving them another allocation. Well, I went back to DC and talked to Ann. I'm like, look, I don't understand how this stuff works. You know? So again, and they reconsidered their decision and gave Free at Last the money. So again, it was about, for me, it was about creating access. That's what my role was. Taking because I always saw East Palo Alto as we used to say, a diamond in the rough. We just needed the resources to help move us forward. So that's what I concentrated on as I was on the city council.
Okay, tell a little bit about the beginning of redevelopment.
Yeah, it was a struggle actually. So the shopping center. We originally had a developer who was going to do the shopping center, but he went bankrupt, right? So now, here we have this space, and see, I mean, for me, again, you have to figure out how to bring money in to operate the city, right? So, you look around, and where do people make their money? They make their money off of commercial property, they make their money off of bringing in revenues, right? So, when the shopping center development fell through, we made a decision as a council that we needed to move this forward because we saw that as a catalyst for economic development for the community. We then had to take on the task of becoming the developers. I mean, we made a hard decision. It's like, okay, well, we'll develop it then, and they're not going to do it for us because we have to do it for ourselves then. This was at the same time, around the time that we became the homicide capital, okay? Being the homicide capital brought us a lot of attention. Governor Wilson created a high crime task force to help us, and mainly it was because people didn't understand that there was Palo Alto and there was East Palo Alto. So people were thinking that this stuff was happening in Palo Alto, where Stanford was. So wait a minute, they need some help down there. So he created this task force. And the task force was led by a gentleman named Ray Johnson, a brother too. After the first meeting, he and I sat down and I said to him, I said, Ray, you know what? The solution is not just police. We definitely need help in getting the crime under control, okay? Because you have to create the environment for economic development. But that's not the solution. The solution is that we need access to resources, and we don't have that, okay? So he set about putting in place all those, bringing the departments together, and we met every 6 weeks to focus on what is it that East Palo Alto needed, and how can we make that go forward, okay? Well, it's election year. So they call up, they want to know if Pete Wilson can come here and address the community. They was calling it the Wilson and Wilson Show. It's like, yeah, that's my cousin, right? So for me, I said, okay, how do I make this work for us? So through Maida, we arranged to take him on a tour of East Palo Alto. We roll past the shopping center, we roll along East Bay Shore, right? You know how raggedy it used to be for East Palo Alto Park? Then you get into Palo Alto and it's smooth sailing. I did that, right? We come around Embarcadero, we come across the overpass. He looks down, he says to me, Miss, I don't mean to insult you, he says, but I don't understand. He said, this is a prime location. I don't understand why this hasn't been developed. And I said to him, well, I don't mean to insult you either, but it's because we are a black and brown community, and we don't have the clout in Sacramento to give us the kind of resources that we need. And let me give you an example, Governor. We needed $3 million to take down the sound wall along 101 in order for you to see the shopping center. Nobody's gonna put a store there if you can't see it. We were number 357 on the list for funding. It would have taken us 15 years to work our way up the list. So I use that as the example. And I said to him, we can't wait 15 years. If we wait 15 years to get that money, we won't be here. He went back to back to Sacramento, and 2 weeks later, we got a call from Caltrans that we had been bumped up to the #1 funded project in the state. And that is how we got the sound wall down. That's how we started because that shopping center was it. It was the catalyst for economic development. So, again, access to resources.
All right.
Good, that's good.
All right, Rose Jacob.
Okay, so I was privileged to have been asked to run for city council in 1992, which was, as Sharifa just mentioned, was one of the worst years in our city's history. But I was asked by a number of people who was seeking out to determine who they were going to actually ask. And I was hosting at my house, but I was the one who actually was being discussed at that time. And I've never forgotten that meeting because it was very meaningful. It was at a very difficult time, but they wanted someone that they felt that they could actually trust to really demonstrate leadership, courage, and professionalism, among many other things, the courage and all that it requires to really be a good leader. And I thought about it for a while, because this was probably in February of '92, and so by the summer I had talked to my family and made the commitment to really do so. But a couple of factors that, aside from that discussion and the encouragement I had gotten, was the displeasure I had in hearing or reading in the papers some comments from our own mayor, who was talking about staying off the streets of East Palo Alto. That angered me, to have someone who's in a leadership role in a city and telling people to stay off the streets. And having been one who have a mother and father who had moved to East Palo Alto because they cared about the community. My mother is now older, and thinking about all of the elders in the community, and I was thinking, they don't like the environment they're in, and we need to be ones to do something about it. So that was one of the things that really kind of encouraged me to run for city council at that time, because it was a very challenging time. But I was also determined that if I got on the city council, we had to demonstrate what leadership really means. And that means that we had to actually present ourselves in a way that was that the community could respect us as leaders in the community, that we actually establish goals and objectives so that we can have some sense as to what direction we want to go, and then look at it and then know exactly how we're going to approach it. Economic development, of course, had to be prime, but public safety was also an issue. So we set up our goals and priorities, and I actually have a list of those at home now. And we began having retreats so that we could come together as a council to determine what do we have in common, what are our values, what's important to us, and we actually established those priorities along with hiring a city manager who could actually help us to implement them. And so that's what actually was, so we established ourselves in such a way that we could achieve the success that we ultimately have received. It was a very challenging time, but it was also one that required us working together in a unified manner so that we didn't have the media promoting us as unsophisticated and disorganized and people who were fighting, and so because the media did not help at all either. So, and then you have them quoting one person out and having opposing views. Those didn't help us to be able to maintain ourselves in terms of setting examples of any real leadership. So we actually, as a council, had to make some decisions about how we would demonstrate that leadership. So one was that we would establish ourselves in committees so that everybody had a role that they could take and be responsible for, because there was a lot to be done. So we determined the mayor and vice mayor, and because we were in the midst of creating economic development and talking with contractors and looking at who's going to be our economic development leader and making those very important decisions. You got to have that continuity. So we actually established as a council that we would have the mayor and vice mayor, the mayor especially serve in a 2-year term for a while as opposed to the 1 year. Why? For the sense of continuity and demonstrating that we were serious about our plans and objectives for that. So what I'm sharing with you is some things that people that gets lost sometimes, and when it comes to actually seeing the city move forward, it requires having the right decision-making processes in place to make that happen. It doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen by just one person. It actually has to be the whole council working together to make that happen, and that was what my commitment was. Because if it wasn't going to be able to work, I wouldn't be able to function very well. So I worked very hard working with Sharifa and the council members to make sure that we actually all had some real important role that we could take ownership of, and actually make sure that we were working with our commissions as an example, and making the recruiting good commissioners and getting more of the community engaged in that aspect. And that was extremely helpful. We established this public safety committee that focused on code enforcement issues and grievances, and so we actually did a lot. And then we had the Community Services Commission who focuses on events in the community and looking at the parks and all. And then we established a Public Works and Transportation Commission. That was established during that time. Why? Because each council member had the responsibility of overseeing and being the liaison for a commission. And what happened was that you had more and more of the community then getting engaged in the decision-making process. That too was very helpful in seeing the city grow because there was more people involved. So when we had our tax measure campaign, we had the community actively working with us because they understood the value of it. They could understand the benefit and how that money was going to be utilized. We had people who didn't want to trust the budget process. What did we do? We brought the budget process into the community as well. You don't want to trust us that we're spending less than what, $500,000 a year? Come on, help us figure out how we can get more and do a better job of using what we have. Because that was, so it's amazing the things that you strive to do when you're in the midst of trying to gain that courage, that respect, and the involvement of the entire community in a very important process. And then coupled with all of this, what I just shared, the other thing is that the community members don't always understand that there's only 2 means of revenue for a city. Retail taxes or property taxes. Everything else you have to apply for through the state, federal government, or foundations or other means. You're very limited in terms of how you can provide the services. So the educational piece was very critical. So when we got people grumbling about our budget and acting as if they weren't trusting that we were doing the right things, the meetings were in the community so everybody could come and be a part of that process as well. So that's what part of civic engagement is all about anyway, and community, bringing the community together, is informing them. And you have to bring people along with you to be able to understand how the government works. So that's one of the things I've learned that doesn't work too well, is the fact that people don't understand it. But once they have a better understanding, a deeper understanding, they actually do a better job. And the other thing is really making sure that we demonstrate the characteristics of what leaders are. So that too is very important. It's not about me and what I think. It's about what's going to benefit the community best, and being informed about what the community wants and what their needs are. So those are some of the things I would say. But you want to talk about the board too, Supervisor? Yeah. So I have to tell you that the experience that I gained from my role serving as a commissioner in East Palo Alto and on the city council, all of the community services activities that I have been engaged in, working with the Palo Alto and Menlo Park and East Palo Alto, all of those efforts helped to prepare me to be able to at least engage and begin to learn what the county government system was all about as well. So I went there with some experience, but with the understanding that I had a lot to learn, because there's a significant difference in the city government and county government. The county is so much larger. There's a lot more departments, and you have the constituency is, of course, a lot greater. And then I had my colleagues on the Board of Supervisors as well, whose experiences were different from mine. And of course, I'm sure you can imagine that. But I came there and knowing that I had to actually determine how I would best demonstrate who I am and and my beliefs and my values. And so I had to really give a lot of thought to how am I going to best position myself so that I send the right message to them, representing myself, my city, and the county. And of course, with my faith and my professional background and the background and all, it was very helpful in helping me to determine how I could be the best I could be, representing all. And I want to be sure that they understood that, yes, I'm from East Palo Alto, but I have the same privilege and opportunity to represent the San Mateo County as you do, and I'm just as prepared as you are. And I'm going to be sure that I have the courage and the conviction and the strength to actually be here to make the right decisions for the right reasons. So that was always, because that's really what's really truly important. It's not, because one of the things I've learned is that leaders are not defined by their title. It's really about their character. So I want to demonstrate that I have the characteristics that allow me to be there, as well as to make the right decisions. And one of my first experiences was at one of our board meetings. Someone had made an assumption about how I was going to vote. And once the vote didn't go that way, which of course I had no idea this person had those assumptions. So when it came to me, he mentioned to me that he was disappointed because I didn't vote a certain way. And so I said, well, how did you arrive at the conclusion that I was going to vote a certain way? And I said, because unless you talk to me, I have no idea how you're going to vote, because I didn't ask, and I don't ask. So I told him, I said, the best thing, what I'd recommend you do is in the future, you can let me know what your views are, your opinions about a particular matter. I said, but the ultimate vote is going to always be mine. So you can let me know, because I said, I do like to make informed decisions, but I don't vote just because someone asked me to vote a certain way. It has to be my decision, because I am responsible for my vote. So that was the beginning, and I didn't have to have that discussion again. Mainly because that's my who I am, and that's what I believe in doing. My vote has to count for me, and because I'm going to be accountable and responsible for that vote. Someone asked me about it, I can tell them why I voted the way I did, and to the point that if I don't believe. If I'm not certain on how I want to vote, I'd rather abstain and/or ask if it can be brought back at another time, because that's how serious it is. So, but I did have to make a lot of very challenging decisions, at the board. But I can also say that, because I'll mention that a little bit later, that you gain the trust and the respect of people based on those characteristics that you actually have. And so I was one who believed in looking at the issues and looking at what's going to be best for East Palo Alto, some of the matters some of the things that we actually needed to have for our community. And so a couple of the things that was important is making sure that our city leaders have the opportunity of developing relationships with San Mateo County, the department heads, and all that. So that was one of the things that I really wanted to ensure that actually occurred. So convening meetings in East Palo Alto, the Asian Adult Services Commission, as an example, coming to the senior center and having discussions with the public defender department, while with David Lewis again, talking with our, with the formerly incarcerated about some of the issues they had, and looking at the expungement of your records and things of that nature that was important. It would not have occurred had I not asked the public defender, executive director to actually do that. So there was numerous of the convenings that I actually hosted, and one of the most important ones that I think has had to have some pretty good impacts was the Crime Reduction Task Force. That's where we had the probation department, the Human Services Agency, public health, and the sheriff's department. There was a variety of departments that was invited to come down to meet with the leaders in East Palo Alto, particularly the nonprofit organizations, to actually have some discussion and talk about how they all can work together to actually look at reducing the crime. And then of course, the youth, have discussions with the youth as well on what we can do to help them to not get in trouble, because we don't want them in juvenile hall. So and that was ultimately during those discussions and meetings that actually they created the sponsored employment program. Was an outgrowth of those discussions and meetings. And so it just gives you an example. So while as a representative, though, my main topics and focuses was on housing, health, and hosted a health disparity summit. Why? Because that was very important to our community as well. So the clinics was, have the influence on making sure that we got this kind of relationship we needed for our clinics, and really happy that has grown to that we now have our own wonderful, fantastic Ravenswood Family Health Clinic. But it was through all of those early years of developing the relationships and working with everyone that actually made that happen as well. So naturally there's a whole lot more, but I'm not going to take up all of the time because I think the time is kind of flowing.
All right, thank you. Next, we're going to have Russell. Russell was in the administration, so this will be a little bit different perspective. So we have the council and board of supervisors, and now we're going to have a look at the administrative part of trying to make something happen through the economic development.
Thank you, Bob. I had the high honor and the privilege of working for the city of East Palo Alto for 30 years. And from its inception until 2013. And so over that 30-year period, I had a chance to see lots of highs and lows and ups and downs. The night of incorporation was a big night for the community, and one of the things I think that's characterized this whole process is the level of expectations people have had. There's always been sort of like a disconnect between what the city's capable of doing versus what people wanted to see out there. It could be anything. It could be the streets being repaired, the street sweeping, it could be the parks, a police officer responds when you call them. Yeah, the city has struggled with in the early years, struggled with all that sort of thing. So, but I'm gonna focus in on the 1990s, the 10-year period that this panel is supposed to be talking about. When the 1990s opened up, the city was 7 years old and had just come off a financial crisis, basically a cash flow crisis in '86 that resulted in the city taking some pretty stringent measures to keep its financial house in order. And one of the things that became clear after that, after all these meetings, was that the city just simply did not have enough money to provide the kind of services that the community wanted. People looked at Menlo Park, they looked at Palo Alto, they looked at other cities on the peninsula, and they saw that we weren't doing any of that stuff. And what became clear and that the council eventually understood is that the city, and like I think Councilmember Gibson alluded to, we needed additional sources of income. Primarily, we needed sales tax. most of these cities in, around East Palo Alto get a tremendous amount of sales tax when you shop at the shopping center, you buy cars there, you go to Target there and other stores. And East Palo Alto didn't have any of that. So, you know, we basically, in the early, late 80s, early 90s, we basically had about $5 to $6 million in revenue. And out of that $5 to $6 million, we had to fund police, parks and recreation, general administration, you know, police, and there just wasn't enough money to go around. And so, by $89, the council and the community passed a parcel tax for 5 years. And I believe that provided an additional $1 million to the city. So what happened to that $1 million was that starting around the late 80s and all the way through the early 90s, you know, the crack cocaine epidemic hit the city. And the murder rate started to accelerate. So all that money, we initially, I think, gave police like $400,000 to $500,000 of that money. We were going to use the rest of it for recreation and street repair. The police eventually took all of that money by 1992. And because they were working overtime and they needed more officers and Because every week people are complaining about the murders and the drug dealing on the streets in the community. So, you know, we knew that the tax had a sunset 5 years, so we needed to get the council and the community, hey, you know, you guys need to generate some more money. And fortunately, in the late 80s with Stan Hall and the council back then, the city manager Stan Hall, they formed these redevelopment project areas. And then they, in the early 90s, especially after Sharifa got on the council and Rose got on the council, and I believe Dwayne Bay and I forget who else was on the council. You know, they started focusing on redevelopment. And you know, I think Sharifa alluded to the point that we thought we had redevelopment ready to take off in 96. And, you know, I forgot the reason why it happened, but yeah, a developer went bankrupt. And, you know, I used to hear people call and say, you guys can't do nothing, you know, there's no way you're gonna, you know, you're just full of it, you know? You'll never, what these people outside the community saying about you is true. You know, you don't know what you're doing, and you'll never achieve any success. And at the same time, we were switching city managers. I think Stan Hall was the city manager in the early 90s, and then the city was fortunate to get a gentleman named Jerry Grooms, who did a tremendous job of resetting the city's relationships with entities outside of East Palo Alto. He, you know, you can't be a city manager too long because eventually circumstances will catch up with you. That's just the nature of those type of jobs and stuff like that. You know, you're eventually going to get fired if you stay there.
He did 5 years.
He did 5 years.
He did 5 years and he stayed 5 years.
Yes. Yeah. So he did a great job, and he took redevelopment, the development process up until, I would say it was like 90–95% ready to roll. And then the city council hired a new city manager named Monica Hudson, who came in and took it over the finish line. I'm not going to go into everything she did, but she worked with the council and other outside entities to I think that one of the most key things that happened was that the city issued bonds for $22 million to do the public improvements for the shopping center. That would never have happened if they had not made these relationships and that Sharifa was talking about and Rose were talking about in terms of helping the city, because the city did not have, clearly didn't have that kind of money. So, so I think the biggest issues hanging over the city for that 10-year period was the finances for the city and the public safety. We hired a police chief named Bernie Matthews, who, in my point of view, yeah, I don't know what the perspective of the elected officials are, but who did a great job for the city. When the governor had this high crime task force come down to East Palo Alto, I never saw so much money in my life. I didn't realize they had that kind of money for law enforcement and public safety in this country. I mean, they opened a spigot that was on the order of $400, $500, $600 million. Yeah, I mean, they were giving this police chief money just out the blue, you know, no strings attached. And before that, you know, we couldn't get the light of day for anything. We didn't have no credibility.
Yeah.
You know? And so that process basically, like I said, opened the door for a lot of resources. High crime task force, other cities on the peninsula were helping patrol city streets. They gave us grants to hire new police officers, and crime eventually started to come down. And I would say by the mid-90s, we had made significant dents in crime in East Palo Alto. And that alone allowed the economic development to take root. Because without that, it would never happen. People would be afraid to come over here and shop or whatever, you know. So, you know, I think that pretty much, well, I should add that one other thing the city is struggled with is, with, you know, the limited tax base, is the ability to recruit and retain employees. Some of the most difficult conflicts the city had internally were when unions would come to us and show us data, what was the average salary for these type of positions in other cities. And we were 25, 30, 40, 50% below the average. And we knew it. We wanted to do something about it. We wanted to join CalPERS. But if we did do that, then the only thing that would have been here would be a police department. I mean, there just wasn't enough money to do all those sorts of things. And we were fortunate that our city council, especially like when Sharifa got on the council and rose, they knew that we were in danger of going bankrupt. And so they really were unified as it came to, you know, pushing redevelopment forward and stuff like that. I mentioned that we had a parcel tax that was for 5 years. That tax expired in 94, and redevelopment was not ready to lighten the load, so we had to go back to voters. And I think we did it for 3 years or 4 years. Yeah.
I think it was
4?
Yeah, I think it was 4.
Yeah, and that helped carry us until the redevelopment finally took over. Home Depot broke ground in 1998, and so there was light at the end of the tunnel here. And it took about a year or so to start generating sales tax. Other stores came online, and really that helped save the city, because the city would not be here if that had not happened.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, you know, I don't know that. You know, I know there's still a you know, not sufficient recreation services. You know, I don't know. The streets appear to be in a much better condition today, but right after that, yeah, the city started allocating more money for that sort of purpose, and crime seemed to get under control. So yeah, there was an improvement starting beginning around the year 2000. So anyway, that's it.
All right, thank you, Russell. All right, as I said earlier, Carlos has been in East Palo Alto for a long time.
Microphone.
Oops.
And he's done a lot of work, especially in the area of housing and demographics. And so I want him to, you know, talk about those areas. The housing situation has been something, and we're now at a major crisis, but it's been coming for a long time. And also the changing demographics and cultural situations in the community have made some significant differences, and those particular communities have also had some difficulties to deal with that we as black people did not have to deal with. The Latino population coming in and the Pacific Islanders, primarily around immigration and employment. So Carlos, the floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me tonight. It's a pleasure to see a bunch of old faces and be up here with perhaps a bad choice of words. Long time known faces. An auspicious way of starting. So I entitled my kind of reflections here is from a bedroom, East Palo Alto, from a bedroom community into the throes of change. Clearly the 1990s were that beginning of that trajectory. Keep in mind that in the 1980s, we actually pretty much were enjoined from doing much development because we had a lawsuit that went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. It was not until the Supreme Court of the United States at the end of 1987 denied cert, which meant they decided not to take the case that had existed since 1983 when we incorporated, that went all the way through the California Supreme Court. Never made it, fortunately. Maybe we can thank Thurgood Marshall for that, I don't know. But never made it before the Supreme Court of the country, and ergo we were a city. But that particular lawsuit, that specter over the city, made it a little more difficult for us to develop. We also had, obviously, some of the financial issues that we were talking about in 1986. We had a very interesting, I guess, slightly crooked financial director, and that was part of the problem. But here we are in the 1990s, and keep in mind, this is a city that since its inception has gone through, does anybody know how many recessions? 4, count them. 1983, in which in this city, interest rates to buy a home were between 12 and 16%. All right? We had one in 1990, which was the Snl Crisis, created by certainly crooked Wall Street brokers in the Snl, and the deregulated Snl savings and loan industry. And then we had 2000, 2001, which again was Greenspan's over-exuberance in the market. More than anything, it was greed among investors who wanted to put money, or at least speculatively were putting money in tech companies that clearly were hollow. And then there was the last one, which is probably the most devastating, which was the 2007 to 2009, some people call it a depression. And certainly for people of color, it still is a depression. So this city has come through a lot and done a lot within the context of 4 pretty significant economic downturns. Takisa Mahiri, I don't know if you guys know. So I started working in East Palo Alto as a freshman in 1978 here and worked on incorporation with Apache. Takisa was I believe a double E, an electrical engineer. I think he used to work for Varian, I can't quite remember. But he was, I believe, either the first or the second planning commission president. And I remember talking to him about the planning commission and the community, and he basically said, you know what, East Palo Alto is a bedroom community, and it shall remain a bedroom community. Which was interesting, because we had the issue of how do we create a tax base, and you cannot create a tax base solely on the backs of residents. But the 1990s really was the period in which the city began to figure out how could we, for lack of a better term, and this is both a loaded term, how could we fiscalize our land, which meant how could we actually gain economic benefit from the land that we presently have, and that means turning it into a higher economic use, not necessarily a better economic use, but a higher economic use. And there are trade-offs, and I tell this to my graduate students all the time. Economic development is not a zero-sum game, there are trade-offs. So we've lost a high school, and to this very date, some people say, hey, we should have retained that. But in exchange, we have a tremendous amount of money that is coming into the city from sales tax and property tax, right? That somewhat offsets it. I say somewhat because we can debate for the longest period of time whether or not it was worth it. We also had what was our shopping center, and granted, there were issues along Whiskey Gulch, but you know what? There was the record store, there were the wig shops, there were the gay bars, there was Jim's Coffee House. There were, that's where, not We Hope, but Free at Last got started, right? There's Club Freak, there was, all of these cultural venues as well as shopping venues. We lost that. Granted, that development per year brings in over $7 million annually, in perpetuity, in both sales tax, hotel tax, and property tax. Whiskey Gulch is bringing in a little less than $200,000. Now, it is a trade-off, and again, we can discuss whether or not we have mitigated the impacts of those developments. But we would not be here today had it not been for the, as we are today, which the city now has about a $41 million budget, if I include enterprise funds, so the water and lighting and all these other districts. So it's a far cry from when we were at $5 million, right? A far cry.
Far cry.
Right. There, you know, clearly there are a number of fund balances that we have to do more infrastructure work, to continue to fix our streets. We have a lot of things to do. I will point out one thing, though, that in the 90s, and this is the tragedy of communities of color, is that the dominant structure wants to throw money at us. They want to throw money at us to basically throw us in jail. The 1990s were about criminalizing people of color.
Yep.
Let's make that really clear, right? So one of the reasons we were getting money is because there was the war on crime, which started with Bush, and then Clinton took up the mantle. As much as we want to say Clinton was a liberal progressive, Clinton abused communities of color. And if it were not for that crime bill, right, there would be probably many more people of color in the inner city. There might be more people alive. Because the crime bill, combined with the criminal neglect around the crack epidemic, which was affecting us, was not affecting the folks in Portola Valley. Because they were snorting it up their nose, right? They criminalized crack, gave us the money to say, clean that stuff up, and ignored the other parts. And part of that is kind of the second piece of my discussion, then led to a changing demographics of this country now, of this city. And I do want to hail someone who's not here with us today. Died in 1999. To me, was really a giant. I think I had two incredible mentors here, three actually, but certainly two black mentors. Number one is Omowale Satterwhite. Started working with him in 1982, straight out of Stanford, on the incorporation movement. And the other person was Ed Bex.
Yes.
Ed Bex was a progressive leftist who had worked as a longshoreman, who understood the connections, very strong connections, between movements of color, right, equity and social justice, could knit those together, right, and say, this is what is happening to our community. This is why we must unify, not become balkanized groups of Latinos, blacks, Pacific Islanders. I miss Ed to this very day, because the conversations I could have with Ed were wide-ranging and certainly thought-provoking. And one of the things that Ed actually said, this was in 1996, a decade ago or so, blacks moved out for bigger housing or jobs in Silicon Valley. And to some extent, that is still true, said Ed Bex, actually quoting from a newspaper article, who moved into East Palo Alto in the late 1940s. But now I think the major reason is the cost of housing. Black people are moving to places like Fremont and the East Bay, and sometimes farther, to Sacramento and Fairfield, to find better housing, homes, and apartments. I also posit that one of the reasons African Americans and black folks left was partially this crack epidemic that ripped apart communities. There were folks who I organized with in 1983, who I saw around in 1987, and by 1990, they were either unfortunately dead or they were in jail. Right. So, the demographics changed tremendously in 1990. They went from, remember, Latinos were 14% in 1980, and blacks were 60%. By 1990, the number had gone to 41% for blacks, and then 36% for Latinos, Latinas. And again, if Ed were here, Ed would say that all that means is that we just have more people that we have to politicize, more people that we have to get into the movement, right? Because what knits us together, I believe, in East Palo Alto is a class and social justice conscience. It's not a color conscience, right? I think we need to respect, obviously, one's blackness, one's Latinoness, one's particular place where they come from. But we need to figure out what unifies us. And I think that in the 1990s, we were beginning to struggle with that. And I'll give you one example, I'll probably stop here. There was a group of kind of, I would say, recently transplanted Latinos who had come here, Nelson Santiago, folks like that, who actually wanted to create a nationalist, I would say, probably Latino, Chicano-centric political slate. And there were a bunch of us, Ruben, myself, the Guzmans, the Aceveses, were saying this is the wrong thing to do. You don't want to come into a community and say, oh, now that we're 40%, we're going to move in and we're going to try to take power. Now, fortunately, Nelson and his ilk lost and left, right? But when I was developing in LA, and I do affordable housing development throughout and now consulting throughout the state, places like Linwood, Cudahy, and places in South Central, they were going through the throes of massive change between Latino and African Americans. So Latinos actually becoming a majority and quote unquote displacing African Americans. That was not a nice fight in the 90s in LA. It did not happen in this community. And that, I think, really to a certain extent, goes to the fact that we do understand the social and economic justice issues that underpin who we are in this community. And we will not, say this into the future, we will not betray those because we're doing, strict, straight party line identity politics. And if Ed were here, Ed could tell us a number of stories why the Longshoremen's Union, which was an integrated union ultimately, was able to prevail in many ways because of the way those formative groups came together to work on labor issues up in San Francisco. So I will leave it at that. There's certainly much more to be discussed, but it is great to be in East Palo Alto. And again, I think we are an example for the entire state about how we can, one, grow. Granted, we have problems. There's displacement happening now. One might even say the throes of change actually now mean the throes of gentrification. But that is another issue to talk about. Thank you.
Now I see another member of our panel who was supposed to be on this it's come in. So I'm going to ask Larry if he would like to make any comments, and then we'll go directly into the individual discussion or comments.
But I do want to celebrate just being here today. I had the good fortune of sitting through some of the panel discussions yesterday, and I just really kind of felt like I was at home amongst my elders, and I had the pleasure of hearing some of the stories of how we got here again. And it was very encouraging for me to realize that the story of the East Palo Alto community has many threads to it, many threads. And this is certainly a conversation I believe needs to continue. I don't think we need to wait another 50 years, right, to reconvene. I think we have a responsibility in some respects to make sure that the stories of this community continue to be told. Because one of the things for me in the 90s, when I first arrived in East Palo Alto in 1992, was I had the good fortune to sit amongst the storytellers and the orchestrators of this community. So when you raise Ed Beck's name, it makes me smile, because I had an opportunity to sit with Ed Beck's on numerous occasions. So let me tell you what brought me to East Palo Alto. I'm born and raised in Hartford, Connecticut. And Hartford was a community very similar to East Palo Alto. We on the East Coast had high levels of accountability for each family that was in our neighborhood. So I was raised by the community. and I clearly understood how to respect the elders in my community. That it was okay to sit on the porch, and as the elders had tea, coffee, or whatever beverage was of choice at the time, that it was okay for me and my siblings to sit on those stoops and listen to the stories, and more importantly, to hear about the importance of how we carried ourselves as an individual and certainly as a community. Sharifa, I look at her, she and I both from the East Coast, and we talk often about the importance of that porch environment, sitting on the porches and being able to hear the stories and to connect with East Palo Alto or connect with the community. So that's what happened for me in 1992. I came here as a disciple, working with Victory Outreach Ministry in 1992, because there was a call to action in this community. And I think of Miss Tiambe. I remember seeing her on TV as she was taking up making a stand at Jack Farrell Park. I remember many of you here in the room who used to wear the white hats and the signs, right? I remember those, the Just Us movement. I remember the miracles for me happened on Bell Street. I'll try to make this quick. So, in 1992, there was a gentleman by the name of Papa Joe Stamper. And Papa Joe was a devout Christian who used to be a very high-level drug dealer in the area, right? But his life was touched and things changed for him, right? I see some of y'all nodding. I remember that name. I had an opportunity to partner with him with Victory Outreach Ministry, where there was about 10 of us, and we lived on a house at 450 Bell Street, where Elder Williams' church was, right? So we were in the front house, and part of our challenge was to study the Bible and to learn about the affairs of the community and how to really hit the streets, Whiskey Gulch, and to talk to individuals who are struggling in their addictions and try to give them a pathway, right, towards health and wellness. The other thing that occurred for me out of that house was that it gave me access to Bell Street Gym. So one day, I'm at that house, and I come back from the library, and I walk by the Bell Street Gym. It was about 3:30 in the afternoon. There was a father and a son in the gymnasium. And this father was working with his son on basketball skills. Now, I used to play basketball on a pretty high level, and I asked the father, named Mr. Willie Clifton, who used to run the Bobby Sox program. I said, can I work with your son? Can I show him something? And he said, okay, sure. So I showed the son a couple of drills and things that he can do to help with his ball handling skills. And next thing you know, his dad said, yeah, okay, that'll work. And we have him running drills in the gym. It's just the three of us, I believe. So I said, hey, nice, thanks for letting me work with your son. I walk out the door, I start heading up the street. Next thing you know, a gentleman comes running out of the Bell Street Gym, and he's Steve Smothers. All right, and I see Vicky in the place. Steve Smothers pulls me back and says, hey, come here, I want to talk to you. I like what I saw you doing with that young man in there. Who are you? What are you doing? And I said, well, I'm up here with Papa Joe with Victory Outreach. And he says, hey, man, I want you to get involved with our midnight basketball program. And I said, sure, right. So the interesting thing about the midnight basketball program at the old Ravenswood site for me was that I'm a new kid on the block. It's 1992, maybe 1993. The community is real volatile, right? This new enterprise of crack cocaine had taken off, and our young people just were really confused as to whether they go to school or whether they go to a street corner and sell drugs, right? It was really challenging. So the Midnight Basketball Program was the Department of Justice effort to help communities of color with something, right? So what happened for me at the Ravenswood High School side and being a part of Steve's program was I was the new guy on the block, and he made me the security guard. Right? And he gave me a vest, a horn vest, a whistle, and Mickey Glass smiles, right? And this little light. Now, for many of us, we all know that Ravenswood at the time, the entire parking lot was dark. Right? There was no lights out there at all. So here I am, Larry with the orange vest, and I'm the guy with the little whistle, right? And I have to walk up onto that nobody knows, right? And you're talking about holding on to my faith, right? Believing God brought me certainly for a reason. That He's going to put a hedge of protection around me and cover me in the Senate. Because it was 1992, 93, and you didn't know who you were talking to oftentimes, right? You didn't know how their day went. You didn't know if they were selling drugs, if they had a weapon on them. You just didn't know. And I'm the new kid on the block. And I'm like, hey man, I need you to turn your music down. Like, who's dude? Hey man, hey, you can't be drinking liquor out here, man. You gotta put that 40 away. You can't be, I was trying to stay true to my task, right? To get kids into the gym, right? So we can have some numbers and some measurable outcomes and those types of things. What happened for me was a sense of, it really clarified for me that I was called to the community. Because I went through that entire summer. No harm or danger came my way. No one pushed back on me, right, in a way that was aggressive, right? I wasn't identified as someone that needed to be gotten, right? And that was the language of the neighborhood at the time, right? Who's dude, man? He 5'0", right? I mean, who is it? He got the mid, the G, the Ville, I mean, where is it? Right? And that entire summer, right, I was able to forge a relationship with those individuals. So much so that we not only went from who's dude, but hey man, turn your music down because dude's coming, man. And, because it was important to the city that the Midnight Basketball Program at least provided a place of refuge.
Yes.
For those who wanted to get off the grind, right? Who wanted to have a sense of normalcy. So we made it through the year and the summer. And then I had the good fortune from the Bell Street experience, I had the good fortune of starting to go over to CDI, right? And many of you remember, at CDI, it was the place of nurturing and discussion and, where we were going and issues we were facing as a community, it seemed to me all those issues were being discussed downstairs in that basement at that big table, that big wooden table that I never had an opportunity to get access to. But Omo and the leadership and Bex and Bob and Dorian, what's his name? Dorian Brown?
Yeah.
Dorian Brown, Mrs. Mouton, many of the elders and stakeholders of this community. They allowed me to have a seat on the step, right? And allowed me to sit on the step. And I had an opportunity to hear the stories and hear the strategy and the things that we needed to do. And then when the big community meetings were convened, they happened at Bell Street. And and we didn't even use the gym. We just kind of packed ourselves up in that game room area, right? And it seemed to me like hundreds of people were in there. And they were talking about the affairs of the community and what we could do to make a difference. And I was an individual who said, well, let me work with Maida O'Kello. And Maida, I always give a thumbs up to Maida because his mentorship and his leadership for me, right, was critical for to validate who I was as related to this community. And Maida gave me an opportunity to continue with the Midnight Basketball program. And what happened for me at the Midnight Basketball program was I went from being the guy who was in the parking lot to coaching a team. And I had they had a big draft, if you would. I'm the new guy, I don't know all the players, right? So I was able to get what was left. And I got, you know, and I was blessed with 10 kids who really wanted to play basketball, but yet never could find their way on a team.
Right.
Right? And by being given those 10 individuals, I was able to mentor directly with these young people. And some of the things that we did for them were things that a father would do for their son, right? We said, you gotta be accountable. Practice starts at 6 o'clock, you don't walk in here at 6 o'clock, right? You gotta be in a uniform. You can't come in here with jeans, right? We're gonna start calling each other by name, and ain't just gonna be rogue and this and that, right? If one of your teammates is struggling with addiction, drinking, smoking weed, and those types of things, all of us gonna, right, get involved in that discussion and hold that individual accountable. So what happened that summer, these 10 individuals, when the summer league started, when the Midnight Basketball program started, we won the first 7 games of the season. That's right. That's right. Larry and his guys. And what happened was, my little group, because, you know, part of it was, you show up to practice on time, you do the things that we ask of you to do. Every other weekend, I'm gonna take you on a field trip. I'm gonna take you somewhere. I'm gonna put you in that broken down van, and we're gonna take you to a city, right? And we're gonna allow you to experience that city, right? We're gonna go to a museum, we're gonna go to a park, we're gonna go to a movie, we're gonna go to a theater, right? We're gonna teach you how to use a knife and a fork. And those opportunities to mentor that core group of kids, they became Larry's ambassadors. Because not only were they winning on the basketball court, but they were starting to really build up some self-esteem for themselves. And then the interesting thing about that summer was they won the championship. They lost one game. They won the championship. They became the guys around town now. And then I had 2 individuals who I was working with as I was mentoring them as assistant coaches. The next year, we were able to give them not only that team, but create another team. And they were able to take that methodology that we used for the teams that they inherited. And then, Russell remembers this, we had well, let me back up a second. Maida gave me an opportunity to become the head of the Midnight Basketball League. I'll take about 3 minutes. And when he gave me that opportunity, I said, well, part of the challenge is I'm not a strong advocate of my son or daughter coming out of the house at 10 o'clock at night, right, to go watch a basketball game or to play in a basketball game and then oftentimes start heading home at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. It didn't seem like a good strategy. And Maida gave me support, and we turned around and we created a Twilight Basketball League, where we started bringing in the young people at 6 o'clock in the evening, right? And we provided skill development training. We brought speakers in from the local colleges and universities. We brought college coaches in to start teaching them how to play the game of basketball correctly and talk about the expectations. We brought the Employment Development Division, right, to Bell Street Gym for 4 nights. Because we were oftentimes just telling our kids, hey man, you gotta get a job. Well, our reality at that time was you would have to take 2 buses to get out of this community to get to Sunnyvale or to get to San Mateo to apply for a job. And many of our kids would get there and they would get discouraged because they didn't know what the culture of looking for work was. We had Bayshore Employment Center down in Whiskey Gulch, which was a tremendous asset for the community. So when we convinced EDD to come to Bell Street Gym, right, and the kids would walk in, they would see a mock EDD center set up in that little gym. And then we would talk about the importance of having your ID, right, or having your birth certificate, or having a number 2 pencil so you can complete applications. It strengthened them, right, as related to going to the job centers. And then ultimately we started getting a list of jobs that were available, and they would bring that information into the community. Because many of you remember, our kids struggled with leaving the community and telling potential employers they were from East Palo Alto. They oftentimes would use 94303 and say, I'm from Palo Alto. Give me an opportunity, right, to talk to you about a job. So I talked about Victory Outreach on Bell Street. I talked about CDI, right, the Bell Street Gym. In the 90s, there was no safe place for young people to gather, as I saw, and as many people saw. Because Bell Street was infected, right? We had prostitution across the street, drug sales going on behind the building. There was a lot of challenges. Our budget for the department, I think, was like $107,000 a year. We had 3 full-time employees and 4 part-time employees. So what we did was what we do here in East Palo Alto. We built relationships. We started going over to Stanford. We started, talking to the San Francisco Giants, the 49ers, other organizations, said to them, our kids deserve an opportunity to participate in your venues, right? We need tickets, we need transportation support, and we need those types of things. That was a game changer because we were trying to incentivize the young people in the gym to come without weapons, without drugs, with the right attitude. And they would oftentimes say, if I do that, what are you going to do for me? And I can't tell you how many times Moody and I and the entire department would take a young person to their first football game, baseball game, or basketball game. And the ability to have that mentoring relationship on the way back, right, was, you just couldn't put a price tag on it. You built into those relationships. You earned the trust of these individuals. I want to say this. Rose Jacob Gibson came to the Victory Outreach Center. I think I was there maybe a week or a week and a half. And she wanted a team of volunteers. She had talked to Papa Joe Stanford to come to the Ravenswood High School and just clean up and do a cleanup project. And we went. What happened for me was I had the opportunity to hang out with Rose, who was our work leader, for about 4 hours. And she began talking to me about the importance of this community, the importance of the Ravenswood High School, and the importance of serving this community. This is an individual I had just met, and she poured that into all of us. But I was probably the only one that really captured that as an invitation to work with this community and to serve this community. So thank you for having me, and I'll just stop right there.